She was left at the train station with a baby and no name until the silent cowboy said, "You do now. Dust Creek, Wyoming Territory, winter 1887. The wind screamed down the tracks, carrying flurries of snow and the scent of iron. The last evening train pulled away, leaving behind a trail of white steam and a single figure standing alone on the frozen platform. A young woman, barely 20, clutched a baby to her chest, its small face hidden in the folds of a worn blanket. Her coat was too thin, her hands trembling from cold more than fear. She stood where the man had left her an hour ago, his words still echoing in her head. "Wait here. I'll be right back." He had not come back. The ticket clerk stepped out from the small office, rubbing his gloved hands. "Miss," he called over the wind, "I need your name for the station book." She didn't answer at first. The snow caught in her lashes melted down her cheeks like tears. "My name," she repeated softly, as though the word itself hurt. "Yes, ma'am," he said, a bit impatient, "your name." "For the record." She looked down at the sleeping child, then at her own shaking fingers. Her lips parted, voice barely a whisper. "I don't have one anymore." The clerk blinked, unsure if he'd heard right, but when he saw her hollow eyes and the crying bundle in her arms, he muttered something under his breath and turned away. She sank onto a bench, the woods stiff with frost. The baby whimpered. She pulled it closer, rocking gently, her mind drifting back to the life she'd lost. Once she had a name, Evelyn Hart, daughter of Reverend Nathaniel Hart, the most respected man in her hometown. Every Sunday she sat in the front pew, her white gloves folded neatly in her lap, her voice soft in the hymns. The townsfolk used to nod when she passed, saying she'd make a fine preacher's wife someday. Then came the summer that ruined everything. He arrived on a stagecoach from the east, a young merchant with fine clothes and finer words. He smiled like sunlight and spoke of cities she'd never seen. He called her beautiful. He called her his salvation. By autumn, she was carrying his child. When the truth came out, her father stood before the congregation, Bible in hand and fury in his eyes. "You have brought sin into this house," he thundered. "You are no longer my daughter. You have shamed the name of Hart. Do not speak it. Do not carry it. Do not wear it again." Her mother stood behind him in silence, her hands clenched around her apron. Not a tear, not a word. That night, Evelyn left her home. She walked down the dirt road with a single blanket and a few coins. The merchant waited at the end of town, promising Wyoming a wedding, a new life. But promises fade faster than breath in winter. Now, standing in Dust Creek, she understood what it meant to be nameless. A gust of wind howled through the open station. The baby began to cry, its small fists flailing. Evelyn rocked him harder, whispering, "Hush, sweet one, Mama's here, Mama's here." But her own voice broke on the words. People glanced at her and turned away. A woman pulled her child closer as she passed. The station lantern flickered low, the flame shivering like her heart. She pressed her cheek to the baby's forehead, whispering prayers she no longer believed in. Then the shadow of a man fell across her. She looked up. He was tall, towering, broad-shouldered, his coat dark with snow. His hat was pulled low, his face half hidden, but the outline of a scar cut along his jaw. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Without a word, he pulled the scarf from around his neck and laid it gently across her shoulders. The weight and warmth of it startled her. Her lips trembled. I have no name," she whispered. "He left us." The man looked down at her, eyes steady, gray as the storm behind him. When he spoke, his voice was rough, quiet, but it carried through the wind like something solid. "You do now." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he extended his hand, gloved, scarred, certain. She hesitated, eyes glistening. The baby's cry softened between them, and when she placed her hand in his, the cold didn't feel quite so sharp. Together, they stepped off the platform and into the snow, leaving the empty tracks behind. The snow had thickened to a dull curtain, coating the world in a hush. Word when she didn't answer. His boots crunched against the ice-backed road. She followed close behind, wrapped in his scarf, her arms cradling the infant, her thoughts spinning faster than the wind. They reached a wooden structure lit dimly by lantern light. The local horse station, half stable, half shelter for cowboys passing through. Inside it was warm, the scent of hay and fire would thick in the air. Richard opened the door and gestured her in. She hesitated only a second before stepping into the glow. The man behind the counter, a stubby fellow with a pipe in his mouth, looked up. Even in Richard, who's the girl, Richard didn't pause. She's with me. That was all he said before brushing past and throwing another log on the stove. The baby stirred in the heat, and the girl, still shivering, found a seat near the fire. She loosened her grip just enough for the child to breathe easier. The stableman raised an eyebrow, but didn't push it. Richard Avery wasn't a man. Folks questioned much. He stood by the door, arms crossed, hat low. His jaw was sharp beneath a faded scar that curved from the hinge of his mouth toward his neck. Quiet proof of some violence long buried. People whispered he was mute, said a bullet had taken more than his voice during the war. Truth was, he'd simply chosen silence. After his wife died, there hadn't been much left worth saying. The girl glanced up at him. Her fingers tugged nervously at the edge of the scarf he'd given her. She didn't understand this man, this stranger who didn't ask who she was or what trouble she carried. He hadn't PRI'd, he hadn't judged, he hadn't even flinched at the crying child. After a while, she spoke. "I should tell you my name." Her voice was small, cracked. Richard looked at her, his expression unreadable. She glanced down at her hands. It used to be Evelyn Hart, but I'm not allowed to use that anymore. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn, torn page from a Bible. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling from more than just the cold. "This was in the blanket I wrapped him in. It's from the book of Job." She pointed to a name scribbled at the top corner in faded ink. "Jane, it's not much," but she hesitated. "Jane, I think I'll go by Jane now." Richard said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he gave a short nod. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. The fire popped in the stove. The baby, small, warm, and safe now, slept in her arms with his mouth pressed to her collarbone. Jane tucked the scarf tighter around him. Richard walked to the far side of the room, grabbed a saddle blanket, and folded it into a pillow. Then, without a word, he placed it gently at her feet. Not too close, not presumptive, just enough for her to feel seen, cared for. She blinked quickly and looked away. The stableman watched all this from the counter, pipe in hand. He gave a low chuckle. "Never thought I'd see the day Richard Avery brought someone in," he muttered. "Guess even ghosts need firelight sometimes." But Richard didn't answer. He simply leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, eyes on the door, silent, steady, and still, and Jane, wrapped in borrowed warmth with no name but the one she chose, leaned into the heat and held her baby close. For the first time in months, the fear began to loosen its grip. Jane had never known silence like this, thick, white, and stretching across the hills as far as her eyes could see. Each morning, she awoke to the soft creak of floorboards and the muffled sound of Richard's boots heading outside before sunrise. He chopped wood, fed the horses, tended to the fences, never saying much, sometimes not saying anything at all. She began to help where she could. She washed what little laundry there was, and boiled water over the stove. She burned the beans more than once. Her first attempt at bread came out like stone. Richard never criticized, just chewed slower. One afternoon, while rocking the baby near the hearth, she noticed the way his little legs kicked the air restlessly. There was no cradle, just a blanket and floorboards. That evening, Richard disappeared into the barn after supper. When he returned, he carried a wooden frame in his arms, a cradle, handmade, rough but strong. He set it down beside her without a word. Jane touched the edge, her fingers brushing over the knots in the grain. Her throat tightened. "Did you build this for him?" Richard didn't answer, just tipped his hat and stepped outside into the snow. Later that week, she found one of his old shirts hanging on a hook by the door, torn down the sleeve. She sat by the window after dusk and stitched it carefully, the needle moving in rhythm with the baby's breath against her chest. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and hung it back where she found it. She didn't need to say anything, and neither did he. Their days settled into a rhythm. When Jane brushed the horses, Richard hauled water. When she read aloud softly to the baby, Richard listened from across the room, whittling wood or mending gear. But one night, everything shifted. The baby grew hot against her skin, his tiny body limp, his cries thin and high-pitched. Panic clawed at Jane's chest. She had no medicine, no knowledge, no one to call. She burst from her room, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "Something's wrong. I think he's burning up. Please, please." Richard didn't ask questions. He grabbed his coat, took the child from her arms, and wrapped him in wool and leather. Then he crouched low, motioning for Jane to climb on his back, too. She shook her head, but he didn't wait. He lifted the baby with one arm and opened the door. Snow whipped across the threshold like a scream. Jane followed as Richard moved through the storm, his coat flapping, boots sinking into drifts, never slowing. She watched him from behind, the muscles in his shoulders tight with effort, the side of his face pale in the moonlight. By the time they reached the doctor's cabin, Jane's legs had gone numb. Richard didn't knock. He kicked the door twice and walked straight in. The doctor sprang to action. Jane hovered nearby, clutching Richard's scarf between her fists. "Just a fever," the doctor said finally, but a rough one. Richard stood by the window, silent, his hat clutched in his hand. The baby whimpered once, then settled. Jane looked at Richard, and for the first time she saw it. Not just endurance or quiet strength, but a softness behind his eyes. Not duty, not obligation, something closer to love. Not for her, not yet, but for the small life they'd carried through the storm together. A life that didn't even have a name, but still mattered. Still mattered enough for him to brave the cold. It was nearly spring when the knock came. Jane had just laid the baby down for a nap, humming low under her breath when the sound echoed through the wood walls. She flinched. Not many people came this far into the hills. Richard wasn't expected back for another hour. She opened the door halfway and froze. A man stood there welled, rest for a traveler with a trimmed beard, clean gloves, and eyes that studied her like he knew her already. "You must be her," he said flatly, "the girl my brother ruined." Jane's breath caught. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. Who are you?" "I'm Charles Linton, and you've got my family's shame in your arms." He didn't wait for permission. Just stepped inside like he owned the place, boots shaking off snow onto the rug. "My brother's gone," he continued. "Left the state and good riddance, but that baby, he's blood, and he deserves better than this." Jane held her ground, though her knees trembled beneath her skirt. "This is his home now," Charles scoffed. "This a shack in the mountains with a silent cowboy. Be serious, Miss Hart." The name cut like a blade. She hadn't heard it aloud in so long. "I go by Jane," she said stiffly, "Well, Jane, I'm taking the boy. There's a mission orphanage 2 towns south. They have real care, real names." "No," she whispered. "You can't." Charles tilted his head. "You think you'll raise him here, with no name, no money, no family. The law won't side with you. We have standing blood and you." He looked her over with a sneer. "You're just a girl who followed lies onto a train and didn't know how to get off." She stood frozen as he turned, tipped his hat, and left. When Richard returned, she didn't tell him what had happened. Not right away, she couldn't. She washed dishes, folded laundry, and kissed her son's brow that night, as if she wasn't planning to disappear before morning. But when the sky turned black, she packed what little she had. Richard's scarf, the baby's cradle blanket, a pouch of biscuits. She swaddled the child tight and stepped into the snow, heartbreaking, throat closed. She had to go before someone blamed Richard for what she brought with her. Before the peace she found got tainted by the shame she carried. She made it 2 miles into the woods before the snow deepened and her boots slowed. A soft rustle stopped her cold. Then a horse snorted. Then Richard appeared through the trees, astride his mare, lantern swinging low at his side. He said nothing at first, just looked at her with quiet eyes, not angry, not surprised. She blinked fast, clutching the child close. "I wasn't running from you," she whispered. "I was running from what I bring with me." He dismounted in silence, tied the reins to a branch. Then he stepped closer and said, voice low and steady, "Don't run from what don't need running." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She wanted to explain, to confess, but she couldn't find the words. He reached out, not to grab, not to stop her, but to offer his hand. She stared at it, then at him, then placed her hand in his. He turned and without another word, walked back toward the home they'd begun to build, and she followed, the baby quiet between them, the past howling somewhere behind. Jane no longer flinched at every new sound in the barn. What once made her heart jump, the sudden crack of a hoof on wood, the whinny of a restless horse, the creak of the weathered stall door, now only made her glance with calm familiarity. She had learned how to saddle a horse without Richard having to show her more than once. Her hands, though smaller and softer than most ranch hands, moved with growing confidence. She still moved quietly, but no longer with fear. It was the quiet of someone who belonged. Most mornings she rose before the baby stirred. The sky outside would still be gray with sleep, the world not yet awake, and without fail there was always a tin cup of tea waiting at her place on the table. Steaming gently, it stood like a silent sentinel. No note, no spoken words, just presence. It said everything she needed to hear. Someone had thought of her. She was not alone. Her curiosity turned toward the dusty ledgers Richard kept tucked away in an old wooden chest near the fireplace. Numbers, names, dates. Jane wanted to understand them. She asked for no permission. She simply opened one and began. When she made a mistake, Richard would tilt the page toward her without a word, tap once near the error, and wait. Always wait. His patience didn't feel condescending. It made her feel respected, seen, not scolded. That kind of grace was new, and it was healing. At night, she sometimes noticed little things had changed. The stuck drawer now slid open smoothly. The loose board on the porch no longer wobbled. The bent spoon she had left aside now lay straight again in the drawer. None of it was ever mentioned. He didn't do it for thanks. He did it because he cared, and in his world, actions were the clearest language of all. One morning, after stitching the hole in his old glove, she debated what to do with it. She didn't set it back on the table as before. Instead, she walked into the barn, stood quietly for a moment, then hung it beside the stall where his mare slept. The next day, she watched him reach for it. He paused, fingers brushing the leather with a rare softness. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That moment, silent and still, was louder than any thank you. Their connection deepened in gestures. A bowl of stew left by the fire. A shawl draped over her shoulders after a long day. It was like learning a new language, one only they understood. A language of glances, of pauses, of trust. But the world outside their quiet mountainside had not changed. When they rode into town that Thursday for supplies, she kept her head low beneath her bonnet. The baby nestled in her sling, cheeks rosy from the late spring breeze. Richard led the horse, always a step ahead, the shield between her and whatever lay ahead. It happened near the mercantile. A voice rang out, sharp and cruel. Look who the cowboy brought to market. Rescue project or personal pleasure. Laughter followed. Another chimed in louder, mocking. Cowboy saves a ain't that just like a man with too much time and too little shame. Jane froze, the words striking deeper than she expected. Her skin burned under her collar. She looked at Richard, praying he hadn't heard, but he had. Boots scraped wood. Richard turned slow and deliberate. His gaze swept over the sneering faces like a coming storm. The air changed. She's the only one worth staying for. The street fell silent. He turned his back on them all and walked straight to her. She stood frozen, her heart pounding. When he reached her, he simply held out his hand. She stared at it, then placed her own in his, and they walked away together. She didn't need defending, but he did it anyway because with every quiet gesture, every steady step, he had already chosen her. There were things Jane could not say out loud, not even to herself in the mirror, and certainly not to Richard. Words sat too heavy in her throat, too tangled with fear and longing, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. When silence became too much to hold, she wrote them down. It was one of those quiet nights where the walls didn't creak, and the baby had gone to sleep early, his tiny breath warm, and even in the cradle by the hearth. The fire crackled softly, throwing amber light across the floor. Outside, Richard was tending something, probably the barn hinge that had been squeaking all week. She could hear the faint thud of his boots on frozen ground, steady and familiar. She sat at the little table by the window, where the moonlight mixed with the golden flicker of the oil lamp, and took out a scrap of parchment from the drawer. Her fingers hovered for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. At the top, she didn't write his name. She didn't write hers either. She just began, I never expected a man like you. Not because I didn't think you existed, but because I didn't think I deserved to meet you, let alone stay. Let alone be looked at the way you do, like I'm not broken, like I'm not less. I see you, Richard Avery. I see the way you fix things without being asked, the way you leave tea before dawn, the way you listen even when I don't speak. I see the pain you carry, not the scar, but what's underneath it. And I want to say thank you for not turning away when you saw mine. I don't know what love looks like to others, but to me it looks like a man who says nothing and still makes you feel safer than you've ever been. I think I love you. She stopped, pen trembling in her hand. The words on the page didn't shout. They didn't plead. They simply existed, honest and trembling like her heart. She didn't sign it, didn't fold it. She just sat for a long while, letting the ink dry in the hush of the night. The fire soft at her back. Then, with a breath held tight in her chest, she slipped the letter into the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, under a faded shawl and the baby's outgrown socks. A hidden place, a quiet place, a place where secrets could stay safe. It was never meant to be found, but 2 mornings later it was gone. She'd been tidying, clearing winter linens when her fingers reached for the shawl and felt nothing beneath it but wood. The letter had vanished. Her chest went tight. Her eyes darted toward the door. Richard had ridden out early that day to mend a fence down in the east pasture. He hadn't looked different, hadn't spoken more or less than usual, but something in her gut twisted slow and hard. He had read it. All day she waited for something to change, for the look to shift, for the distance to grow. But nothing came. That night, she found a small bundle resting on her pillow, just a scrap of cloth tied with a bit of twine. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. Inside was a simple necklace, an oval pendant of worn brass, not flashy, not expensive, but it had weight. Truth carved deep into its surface were two words, Jane Avery. Her breath hitched, her fingers touched the name. The name she had chosen, and he had now chosen too. The tears came then, quiet ones, the kind that didn't ache, just released. She fastened the chain around her neck, and for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting to be sent away. She felt kept, not owned, but chosen. Jane Avery. She wore the name like a promise and fell asleep with it against her skin. No longer dreaming of the girl she used to be, but of the woman she now believed she could become. The morning was soft with mist. The hills dusted in a veil of new green, as though winter had finally exhaled its last breath, and let spring begin to speak. The air was cool, but not cold, the scent of wet earth and blooming wild flowers rising from the valley. Birds chirped timidly, as if testing the morning for kindness. The sky above was pale, streaked with light like an old watercolor. Richard saddled the mare himself with quiet purpose. He didn't speak, didn't leave a note, just tied a small blanket behind the saddle horn and walked to where Jane stood on the porch with the baby. Without a word, he tilted his head slightly and held out his hand. She didn't ask where they were going. She just nodded, wrapped the baby snug against her chest, and climbed up behind him. The warmth of Richard's back, the familiar scent of leather and pine on his coat, steadied her as the mare began the climb up the winding trail. The trees, still bare from winter, stood like quiet sentinels along the path. Wind slipped between the branches, carrying with it the scent of cedar and distant snowmelt. The silence wasn't heavy, it was reverent, like even nature was holding its breath. When they reached the ridge, Jane knew instantly where they were. A single cedar tree rose from the hilltop, its limbs wide like arms open to the sky. Beneath it, weather-worn and simple, stood a gravestone. No dates, no verse, just a name, Caroline Avery. Richard dismounted first. He didn't speak, didn't look back. He simply turned, arms out, and Jane knew to hand him the child. She did so gently, her fingers brushing his. She watched him hold the baby, not stiffly, not cautiously, but with the familiarity of someone who'd learned to carry something precious, without fear of dropping it. Then she saw it. Beside Caroline's stone, the earth had been freshly turned, but it wasn't a grave. It was a marker, smooth, white, unweathered, and carved into the stone were the words, Jane, the name she gave herself, and I gave my heart to. Her breath stopped. The wind rose, brushing her skirts. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself. Richard turned to her, the child in his arms. His eyes were steady, filled with a silence deeper than any poem. He didn't kneel.